Greetings, comrades and friends, and thank you, John, and thank you for inviting me here. If I sort of waffle too long, please don't hesitate to stop me. I tend to get carried away. But I think to understand the Iranian Revolution of '79, you have to understand that its immediate roots go back to what the Shah did in 1962, which was later on called the Shah's White Revolution. The revolution in '79 is a direct result of that. On the other hand, it has its roots in Iranian history, which go as far back as the constitutional revolution that we had in 1906. And if you look at this history of 100 years or so, you would see the main characteristic of Iranian history has been the intervention by imperialism to stop Iran from achieving any democratic peace or any social justice over the last 100 years. Every struggle in those two directions has been directly suppressed by intervention of imperialism. The constitutional revolution itself in 1906, and don't forget this was the first sort of bourgeois democratic revolution after the Russian Revolution in the whole of Asia, was actually victorious. It forced the Shah to grant a parliament and a constitution. In 1907, the British and the Russian imperialists made a deal. If you remember the British history, there was a huge, what they used to call the big game. There was a huge rivalry between Russian and British imperialism over influence in Central Asia. And the only reason Iran wasn't colonized is because of the rivalry between the two. Neither side would allow the other side to colonize. But in 1907, they reached a deal that, okay, you have the south, you're talking about Iran. We have the north, the Russians, and the middle bit we leave for the Iranians so that we can both intervene. So basically, they created a very weak government, and they wanted a very weak government in the center, directly influenced by these two powers, and they basically had military presence. They made deals with local, tribal chiefs or local warlords, and basically ruled the north and the south. Then the two of them colluded together. At the time, the Russian Cossack army was the strongest military presence in Iran. And they marched on Tehran to stop the parliament. They closed on the parliament, brought the son of the last Shah, which had signed the constitution, put him on the throne, and basically from then on we had a police state. It went on until 1917 after the Russian Revolution. Obviously, the Cossack army was left in Iran without any, Tsarist government to direct it. So the British employed the Cossack army, paid this, salaries, and used it for their own ends. And in 1921, they realized Bolshevik expansion is a major threat. In 1917, after 1917, because the central government was now weakened and Russian imperialism had gone away from the scene, there was again a new movement for democratic change in Iran. In fact, in north of Iran, there was established a Soviet Republic, which lasted for 2 years. So basically, the British said, oh, okay, now we no longer want a weak government. We want a central, powerful government with a standing army which can stand against the Bolshevik expansion. So they organized a coup, brought the father of the last Shah, which was Reza Khan, who was an officer in the Cossack army. They organized a coup, overthrew the Qajar dynasty, and presented this guy as the new Iranian Ataturk, who is going to make a secular and modern Iran. This guy basically became a Hitler ally during the war, so that Russian and British occupied Iran, because also Iran was used as a main supply route for the Russian front. So they occupied Iran, overthrew Reza Shah, and put his son on the throne. After the war, because the regime was weakened again because of the war, there was again a new upheaval in Iran, especially a mass movement for nationalization of the oil against the British. CIA organized a coup in '53, and the Shah who had escaped, the last Shah, brought him back and put him on the throne, and again we had a police state all the way up to '79. Now what happened in that period is in the early '60s, when after the coup they had consolidated their power, they organized a whole new economic policy, which was later on called the White Revolution. Behind this policy was basically a USA drive to sell capital goods to Iran. Basically, if you want to summarize it in one sentence, I think this was a reflection of a change which had taken place in the whole world imperialist system, in which it is no longer export of capital which is the major source of super profits. In fact, if you look at movement of capital since the Second World War, it's mostly between the imperialist countries themselves rather than export to the backward countries. You had after the war what was called by a number of Marxists at the time a period of permanent technological revolution, in which the major source of super profit becomes in innovation, in technology production, or in introducing technology and monopolizing that technology. So basically, for crisis of overproduction in capitalism since the war appears really as crisis of overproduction of capital goods, of means of production. So basically, imperialism, which until now wanted mullahs and merchants and what we used to call comprador bourgeoisie to look after its interests, was not interested in making a capitalist country out of these, third world countries. So the basic plan was to create the infrastructure for a huge capitalist growth in Iran. They carried out the land reform, which basically released 40% of the peasant population from the land, so they could come to the cities and be the new free workers seeking employment. Then paid the money for the land that they had taken from the landlords as shares in the new industry, which was being developed now with the direct help of International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and the Iranian state directly, to organize a huge program of so-called industrialization. The direct outcome of this policy was that the old sections of the Iranian ruling class, which was the Shia hierarchy and the merchant class, these were basically part of the state. They were pushed out of positions of power. You had Bazari merchants, who could at any one day, lend, up to $1 billion, dollar. They had that much wealth, but they were second-class citizens in their own country in which they were the ruling class until, a few years ago. So basically, they colluded together and revolted against the White Revolution. But they were suppressed. The movement was crushed. This is in 1963. Khomeini became famous actually then. He was the leader of that movement. And his opposition to this reforms, so-called White Revolution, was over a number of very crucial issues. He was against the land reform because religious lands were part of the lands to be distributed, and the Shia hierarchy is still today the biggest landlord in Iran. They are the largest landlord in Iran. They were against vote for women because that, according to Khomeini, destroyed the authority of Islam, and he actually accused the Shah of being a Jew. This was the most, vicious attack he could, organize. And also they were against a reform of the local government, because the Shia hierarchy traditionally has a lot of power in localities, because they're mostly part of the ancient Asiatic mode of production, an Asiatic system of despotic rule, which had a center and then local chiefs which were collecting the taxes and sending it to the center, and local mullahs who would sort of be the eyes and ears of the central government in terms of watching over the local governors, not stealing too much money for themselves type of thing, and keeping the population, under control. So they are well, versed in sort of local politics. This is their main power base. And they were against local government because that eroded their power. So bear that in mind. Now go another 15 years later, this is 1976, 77, in which this economic policy, which began in 1962, had reached crisis. Imagine the type of industrialization we are talking about. You're buying technology from the West, producing consumer goods for the internal market, which are so expensively produced that you cannot export anywhere else. At the time, IMF, I remember, organized a study and realized cost of production in Iran, despite the cheap labor, cheap energy resources, etc., is 30% higher than Europe for similar goods. So they couldn't export it anywhere, they couldn't sell it anywhere. So rapidly it became monopolized, this system of use. So you had one guy producing telephone, one guy producing fridge, one guy, it was like the old, Mughal Empire, in which, the Mughal Empire would give, the taxes of that province to this faithful servant. Now the Shah was giving license to produce various consumer goods to a group of his cronies around the royal court. And by early 1970s, you had between 80 to 100 families which more or less controlled the whole of the capitalist economy. Totally monopolized and very bureaucratic, and only with the force of a state could you actually survive. Because you couldn't compete, you couldn't sell outside, a state had to protect, not allow foreign goods to come, and protect your monopoly and don't allow anybody else to produce the same goods, basically. So it became a very bureaucratic, monopolistic, and totally, crisis-ridden capitalist economy, which in 76 produced the first explosion. And the first explosion came not from the working class movement. To be perfectly honest, at the time, working class was a sort of privileged class compared to some of the other layers in Iranian society. Because the land reform and this type of industrialization, which has not got the heart of the economy, which is producing the actual means of production. Even in capitalism, if the section which produces the means of production doesn't grow as faster than the sector which produces means of consumption, that economy would collapse gradually, would, retract gradually. So take that heart out of it, that's no capitalism, that's just, basically packaging goods in Iran. It's basically an assembly plant that turned Iran into basically an assembly plant. So it had limits for growth. What it produced was a huge explosion in urban poor, because all these people released from the land because of the land reform. Out of the old land relationship, whole families were tied up to the same sharecropping arrangement on a piece of land. Now you give one family land, the rest of them don't have land, so they had to go to towns looking for jobs. At first, they could be absorbed because this capitalism was growing. But as soon as it reached its limit, gradually urban poor or shantytown dwellers in Iran began to increase. For example, in '76, when this first, movement took place in Iran, in Tehran alone, which is the capital, which had about 4.5 million population at the time of the revolution, we had almost 700,000 people living in shanty towns. These are all migrants from the rural areas who couldn't find jobs. In fact, the official jargon by the government used to call them people out of limits. It means they were living out of city limits. So this city institution had no responsibility towards these people. They didn't have to provide them electricity. They didn't have to provide them with any of the services. They were called out of limits people. The first clashes took place in '76, in which they had to bring in the army to suppress the revolt of the urban poor in Tehran. Few months after that, the universities, which have always been at the center of political struggle in Iran, given the underdeveloped nature of working class politics, obviously universities have, in the last 100 years or so, played a major political role in, being the hotbed of radical political activity, or political activity as such, because, as I said, we have had since the Constitutional Revolution, give or take a couple of years of respite during the First World War and Second World War, in which the Iranian central government was weakened, we have had a police state. So there was hardly any political activity anywhere else anyway. So universities were the hotbed of political activities anyway, still even today. Then they started. And in fact, the slogan which made the Iranian Revolution possible, which was general strike to overthrow the Shah, was first popularized by the student movement. The students from '76 started raising this slogan in their demonstrations, in their leafleting, etc. Then the writers and intellectuals began. They organized poetry reading meetings in Tehran, in Goethe Institute. The German embassy at the time had a Goethe Institute in Iran, which Iranian writers and intellectuals took over and organized poetry reading nights. And these poetry reading nights turned into huge political rallies in which 5,000–6,000 people would participate, and every night was turned into an anti-Shah, rally. By 1977, workers' movement began to appear on the scene. We had a number of strikes, very significant strikes, which actually won, demanding wage rise, improvement in conditions, nothing radical as such, most very economic demands. And what was very funny, when they become victorious, 2 months later they run a strike again, demanding even more. They realize the regime is weak, the government is weak, so let's go for it. And you could see something is happening. Things are developing in Iran. For a whole period of total, suppression of all political activity, suddenly everything is opening up. Then at the same time, you had Jimmy Carter coming as president in USA, which promised, if you remember, democracy for everywhere, and we don't want dictatorship. So a lot of bourgeois politicians also took this as a signal to become active too. So the bourgeois politicians started coming on the scene. So you gradually saw this movement developing, movement of opposition to the Shah for reforms. As I said, at first, it had students as a major element in it. It had the urban poor as a major element in it. And it had the working class entered it a bit later, but already a major part of it, already showing its power by, especially the strike in the oil industry, was a major blow to the stability of the regime. And also Iranian intellectuals, Iranian writers and intellectuals, who are again a major force in Iranian politics given the underdeveloped nature of class struggle in Iran. I mean, at the time, people like us would say, okay, Iranian revolution is coming. This was our analysis. A revolution is coming. This is in, I remember the group to which I belong, in 1977, we made this declaration that next Iranian revolution is actually brewing up, because you could see it. I mean, you couldn't miss it. A year later, suddenly, mullahs appeared on the scene. This is a year later, it's 78. And to be honest, if you now look back at it, a lot of it was orchestrated. A lot of it was manipulated and orchestrated. Because we had religious opposition. It's not that they didn't exist, they existed, but it was hardly significant. I mean, Khomeini was in Najaf in Iraq. He was exiled into Iraq, and every now and again he used to write a sermon or send some tapes of his sermon, which were hardly political. Suddenly they brought him to Paris, which now turns out under direct negotiation between French and US imperialism, who brought Khomeini to Paris. In Tehran itself, suddenly in the papers, a very nasty article, and don't forget, this is Iran run by the Secret Service. This is Iran run by SAVAK, the Secret Service, yeah? That nothing goes into press without your approval. Absolutely nothing. Yeah? All press is official press, there's no political parties, only official press and official single political party. This nasty piece appeared against Khomeini. Out of the blue, absolutely for no reason. A week later, religious upheaval demonstration, why have you insulted Ayatollah Khomeini? And now that a lot of memories and biographies have been written, it appears at the time USA decided, this is the guy who was the first foreign minister after the revolution, Yazdi, who is now disowned by the Iranian regime. He was part of the reformist faction and is now been expelled, more or less. He's not exiled, but he's more or less in USA now than in Iran. He's written his memoirs, and in it he actually gives the whole story. There were three groups negotiating directly with US imperialism to persuade US imperialism that the Shah is gone. The only way you can survive, the only way you can safeguard your interests in Iran is to back Khomeini. That's the only alternative. There's no other alternative. The other alternative is left. If you want Soviet Union, at the time was still Soviet Union, or the Iranian left itself was quite strong. If you don't want these people to take over, then your only alternative is Khomeini. And there were three groups directly negotiating with US imperialism in Iran, in France, and in Washington itself, trying to bring USA to agree to support Khomeini and tell the army and the SAVAK to support Khomeini, which is what happened. They sent a general from NATO to Iran. He sat down, negotiated with various leaders of the opposition, and they basically decided, and in Guadeloupe, which was a G7 meeting, if you remember directly, a few months before the Iranian Revolution, they actually persuaded all the G7 countries also that our only alternative is to, in order to keep the state, if you don't want the bourgeois state destroyed, then we have to keep the army and SAVAK and the state, and the only way to do that is to back Khomeini. So if you want a regime change, we have already had a regime change. All these regime changes we have had in Iran have been imperialist, instigated in the first place anyway. Even Khomeini himself was, as I said, pushed to power by this deal. So the army took back, the SAVAK actually started helping Khomeini's leadership. I was just telling a comrade an hour ago, Ayatollah Karoubi, who was the Speaker of Parliament in the last parliament in Iran, who was also a candidate for the presidential election when Ahmadinejad was elected. He, for example, this is a fact which has now just come up. He was released from Shah's jail a year before the insurrection. He's the guy who set up the military committees in Tehran, which immediately after the insurrection took power. The insurrection took place in Tehran. And this wasn't part of the plan. The Royal Guard didn't like this deal that has been made between USA and Khomeini's leadership. The Shah himself actually has made, they have released this statement after he died, that he himself felt USA is trying to get rid of him. He's complaining to USA, what have I done? Why are you trying to get rid of me? You know, why have you lost, you know, your support for Iran and me? You know, this is the exact sentence from. So he himself thought they are trying to get rid of him. And this is Savak. Savak releases one of the pro-Khomeini religious leaders in jail to set up committees for what? To take power a year later. So if you now look back at history with all the fact and evidence that has come out, in fact, USA, in order to defeat the left, in order to defeat the real revolution, in order to defeat the real mass movement against the Shah for reform, in order to safeguard their interest, made a deal. They weren't happy about it, but they made, as in Iraq, they are not happy with the fact that they have to make a deal with Shia clerics, but they have no choice. So they made a deal with Khomeini. And of course, same as in Iraq, that is now hoodwinking US imperials into believing, oh, this is democratic Islamic state. This is precisely what was, you know, sold in 1979. No. Khomeini said, no, I would go back to Qom and be, you know, do my religious studies. I don't want to interfere in politics. This is 1 week before the insurrection, he said this. 1 week after the insurrection, they took power completely. And never left Tehran, let alone for 1 minute to go to Qom to even visit, you know, his old friends. He never, for 1 minute, even left Tehran after that. So, what I want to say is, first of all, Shia clerics and the merchant class in Iran, which now basically rule, they are the dominant class in Iran and rule, was part of the capitalist ruling class before the revolution, was part of the traditional Iranian ruling class from the time of Safavid period in 17th century. They were part of the ruling class. But because capitalism required, you know, changes in the structure of the state and in the structure of the ruling class, these people were pushed out of positions of power. So they were obviously anti-American and anti-Shah. And if you look back at the content of their opposition, right from day one, it was a totally reactionary opposition. They weren't against imperialism, they were against the West. He has never mentioned the word imperialism, always the West. It's the West, it's the anti-Islamic West, it's the Christian West. Democracy to these people is a conspiracy by the West to destroy Islam. That's their take on what is democracy. In fact, there's this slogan of Khomeini which says, because you can imagine, having heard this brief history of Iran, that anti-imperialist sentiments runs deep in the Iranian population. I mean, we have been fighting it for 100 years, so you can imagine how deep sentiment it is within the Iranian anti-imperial. They turn anti-imperialism to an anti-Western ideology, anti-other than Islam type of ideology. They took over the state, they established a theocratic rule, they hoodwinked the population at first because they had promised the Constituent Assembly after the insurrection. Instead of a Constituent Assembly, they organized a referendum. do you want monarchy or Islamic Republic? So everybody voted for Islamic Republic. We obviously don't want monarchy. So it's okay, now that you have voted for Islamic Republic, you are no longer entitled to participate in drawing the constitution because it needs Islamic experts to do the constitution. So they basically disfranchised the whole population and brought in mullahs to sit down and write a constitution, which has been it's one of the most ridiculous constitutions ever seen. We obviously didn't vote for monarchy, so we have a republic. But in this republic, nobody, no institution, no parliament, no cabinet, nobody in this land has any power beyond what the chief mullah says. So basically the Pope, in this case Ayatollah Khomeini, the chief mullah, whatever he says is the law of land. So you have parliament, but he has appointed a guardian council, Islamic guardian council, which vets every member, every candidate to that parliament. First of all, they filter every candidate for being non-Islamic. Then among the Islamic, they filter anybody who is against power to the chief mullah. This is called velayat faqih in Persian constitution, means the rule of the chief, cleric. Anybody who is opposed to the which a lot of religious people are themselves, because they think they should not participate in government, as they should keep themselves from, affairs of earthly government. So basically they have established a theocratic regime, which is a capitalist regime. Don't forget, this is part of the old capitalist ruling class. This is not like some even British leftists, like SWP, thinks this is a petty bourgeois movement. It's not a petty bourgeois movement. As I said, the Shia hierarchy is the biggest landlord in Iran. They are still the biggest landlord. Even after the land reform, they were still the biggest landlord in Iran. And they have obviously mobilized the urban poor and sections of the petty bourgeoisie as their foot soldiers. But it's by no means a petty bourgeois movement. It's financed by the merchants of the bazaar and ideologically sort of supported by the Shia hierarchy. So it's part of the ruling class, but the more reactionary wing of the ruling class. And don't think they are even anti-imperialists. They are the ones who collaborated in 1953. Exactly the same groups of people collaborated in 1953 with CIA coup, which brought the Shah back. And when the Shah in 1960 did the White Revolution, obviously they revolted against the Shah. But previously they actually collaborated with CIA to bring the Shah back. So, and they have organized the most vicious campaign against the left that we've seen in recent history. Iranian left has been more or less totally decimated. In one summer alone, in 1987, they killed 47,000 people. 12,000 of these are leftists. The rest are sort of mujahid, the religious opposition. We used to call the Shah the butcher of the Middle East. He had executed in his rule 500, 600 people. This guy, in one summer alone, executed 47,000 people. This is not adding to this 80,000 or so which were executed in various campaigns against national minorities. These were because the Iranian regime, soon after it took power, organized a military campaign against the Kurdish nationality in Iran. Because in Iran you have all along the borders national minorities. Baluchis on the Pakistan border, Kurds on the Iraq and Turkish border, Azeris or Turks on the old Soviet Union border, now Azerbaijan border, Turkmens on the Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan borders. You have all along Arabs in the south, so you have all along the Iranian border national minorities, which have been suppressed since Reza Shah's time, when they established this new central government. So they organized a military campaign against these national minorities to suppress them. And this is the first year after the revolution. And they killed almost 90,000 people there. So this is a regime which has executed, these are people for which we have names. These are, not exaggerated figures. These are, well-documented figures collected over the last 20, 30 years. So it has actually literally killed almost 150,000 leadership of the various opposition. All political parties are illegal. Even religious opposition is not allowed. So don't think it has anything to do with religion as such. It's nothing to do with religion. It's simply using the Shia hierarchy has always used religion as a cover to, do the work of the ruling class, basically. And it has, managed to hold on to power by sheer suppression, by sheer force of, fascist thuggery, as it were, until about 6-7 years ago, in which a new mass movement began to emerge. And 4 different parts again to this mass movement. A workers' movement, a student movement, this time a women's movement, and also the national minorities movement. Women's movement, because of the suppression they have suffered in the hand of this regime, have been very active all throughout this period. But what was very significant now is for even before the revolution, although we had workers' strikes and a lot of workers' activity the last 3 years before the insurrection, it wasn't really a workers' movement as such. It was a sort of very spontaneous reaction to things. And it wasn't organized because no trade unions were allowed, no political parties were allowed, no organization existed inside the working class other than some small secret, CP organization which existed from before the White Revolution. But they were in the traditional industries which were bypassed now, like print or textiles. But after the White Revolution, you have new industries developing and a new working class which had no tradition or no experience of class struggle as such. But now, for the first time, we see a working class which sees itself as a working class. And it began demanding independent organization. This was the first, major issue which was picked up by the workers' movement, which itself is very significant demand for to show how the workers' movement is actually beginning to become conscious of its class, character. And this struggle has been going on for the last 6 years or so. It's, I think, a major turning point. It could be a major turning point in the Iranian workers' movement. But since the occupation of Iraq, the whole thing has turned upside down. Because basically the Iranian regime is now using the threat of war to suppress every movement. If you want to arrest anybody, given the anti-imperialist sentiment which runs deep in Iranian society, any workers' activist, you arrest him, you say he's a collaborator with foreign imperialists. He is endangering national security. There was a movement called 1 million signatures organized by women. These are Islamic women. These are women who are actually part of the regime, but some of the Iranian left by mistake calls them Islamic feminism. I mean, it's a contradiction in terms, Islamic feminism. But anyway, these are semi-religious currents who are now becoming, aware of the anti-women policies of the government and trying to organize. They try to organize 1 million signatures around a petition which simply demands minor reforms of the constitution, to give equal rights to women, not on every issue, on some of the fundamental religious issues they didn't even dare to mention it, but really minor issues like the right to inheritance, the right to travel, which they don't have, The right to inherit half the men. If you want to travel, you have to get permission of your brother, your father, or your husband before you can travel. Even inside Iran, you cannot travel without permission of your male guardian. So even that has now been suppressed and its leadership arrested for endangering national security. So to be perfectly honest, if you didn't know the world situation, you would have thought, Ahmadinejad and Bush talk to each other on the phone every night. He says, you say this tonight, I say I do that tomorrow. Because as soon as he makes a threat, in Iran, few more workers, women, students are arrested and put in jail for collaborating with Bush. We know why imperialism goes into war. Capitalism always, in crisis finds war the best solution. This is no surprise why, I don't have to sit here and explain why imperialism has gone into this war drive. Whenever you have a crisis, war is the best solution. Not forgetting the fact that after the collapse of Soviet Union, USA has to establish its hegemony even over its own imperialist friends. So it has become, this neocon, policy of dominating the world through whatever means, not allowing any independent army anywhere in the world to even raise his head, anywhere, in case in 50 years' time it may become a threat to our interests. So we know why USA is interested in this war drive. And we know the Iranian regime is actually, feeding the flames of this war itself, because it uses the threat of war in Iran to actually suppress the new rise of the mass movement, which is, I think, again showing signs that a new revolution is brewing up in Iran, a new mass upheaval is brewing up in Iran, because we have huge crisis now in Iran. We have almost 10 million unemployed. We have, you may not believe this,
did it revert back the economy?
Yes, it's basically merchant economy now, except few areas in which you have no choice, like, the state basically needs it. So basically they buy goods and sell it, merchant class is now, and they have the oil money, which has quadrupled, and, they are...
It doesn't export like before. It didn't export before, and it still doesn't export.
It doesn't export anything. It's even food stuff, in which we were at least self-sufficient. In Iran, don't forget, Iran is 6 times the size of Britain, in terms of land. Almost half of it is desert, but there's still the other half. There are parts in which, if you do proper agriculture, could feed the whole of Middle East. It's so fertile, But we are now importing food stuff too. So Iran is absolutely, exporting zilch. 1% of the total foreign exchange earnings is non-oil other things, and these are raw materials again anyway, other raw materials. But oil and gas makes up 98.7% of Iran's foreign exchange. So you have now 6 million heroin addicts. Iran has now become, under Islamic rule, the biggest exporter of sex workers in the entire Middle East. It's bypassing, Southeast Asia now soon, in terms of numbers being exported from Iran, because of the economic crisis. And you have a major, political upheaval, just waiting for the opportunity to, come up. And it is because of this that is so crucial in this anti-war campaign. We don't lose the sight of the other side. Because, to be perfectly honest, given past history, I would not be surprised if USA and the Iranian regime make a deal 2 years down the line, 5 months down the line, 6 months down the line. Make a deal, because at the moment they're just USA is trying to pressurize them to capitulate in Iraq, because in Iraq and Afghanistan, Iran now has a major influence. They can actually completely, destroy USA plans in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And USA knows this. In fact, without Iranian support, USA could not stay in Iraq, even for 1 week. Bear that in mind, despite all the rhetorics. Behind the scene, if there isn't Iranian backing for US presence in Iran, it could not last for much longer. So I wouldn't be surprised, I would finish, I wouldn't be surprised if somehow, imagine a year down the line, Iran says, okay, we have done enough enrichment, we don't want to do any more enrichment. That would be enough, a good signal for them to, basically recognize the Iranian government. If that happens, it means basically we are, sold down the road. Basically the workers' movement, the student movement, the women's movement would be left at the mercy of these, vicious thugs to suppress even further, even further, even further. So it is absolutely vital. Of course, you cannot equate the damage that U.S. imperialism can do to the world to what Islamic fundamentalists in Iran can do. But nevertheless, we cannot forget the two sides of this equation. In any campaign against U.S. military, drive in the Middle East, we have to bear in mind that we should not fall into the trap of supporting the Iranian regime as somehow, some agent of, anti-imperialist struggle in the Middle East. It's actually killing and destroying the real anti-imperialist movement in the Middle East, which is the workers' movement, the student movement, the women movement, and the movement of national minorities in Iran. It was because of this, and given the nature of the British left that you are more familiar than myself, it was obvious they would fall to for this trap of defending Khomeini, and we've seen it, defending the Islamic regime as the latest anti-imperialist hero that we have to defend, was totally forgetting the mass movement of opposition to this regime inside Iran. Of course, U.S. imperialism would, alongside this, try to defend parts of this movement against Khomeini inside Iran. But their allies are the reformists within the government itself. What USA is trying for is some regime change from above, keeping the state as it is intact, except reforming, the Islamic government to what is democratic Islamic government, i.e. something which they can control a bit better. So I think, first of all, the contradiction between Iranian regime and U.S. imperialism is real. It's not that it's unreal. It's not phony. It's not, there are conflicts of interest. But it's in no sense or no shape or form progressive. It's totally reactionary, and we should never support it. And we should never forget our only allies in this campaign against the war is the actual Iranian people, Iranian workers, those who oppose this regime, and those who are the real fighters against imperialism inside Iran. So I would urge comrades, because this threat, despite the fact that after that release of that intelligence report seems to have sort of calmed down a bit, the threat is there. The only reason it hasn't happened is because I think USA at the moment is in no position to do this. And I don't believe, if Obama comes or Hillary comes, this is going to go away. This threat is real, and it would come again, would be revived again. USA has tried this many times. This is not the first time. USA has tried, to intervene by military means inside Iran. So this is not the first time. After Iraq, they thought they were in a position to, do the final shot, but they are not at the moment. As soon as they are, I'm sure the threat would, become as apparently real as it was, a year ago. So, but even if that is, not going to happen in the next 2-3 years, the mass movement against this regime is real in Iran. The suppression of this mass movement by the Islamic government is real in Iran. And we should not lose sight of the fact that the only way we can help it is by organizing a massive solidarity movement abroad. So I urge comrades to join us in Hopi, those of you who are not, and help us in building this campaign. Sorry if I forgot.
Thank you very much.